Okay, so trying to conceptualize God, I became pretty serious about this at one point. Just yesterday, I'm so delighted to announce, just yesterday, the expanded new edition went from the designer to the printer. So in about 2 weeks, it should be on Amazon.com. Probably sooner, hopefully, but I don't know. But in any case, I decided to do this book shortly after 9/11. I imagine most of you remember where you were when you heard about 9/11, what your reaction was. To me, I can tell you it was by far the worst day of my life. So I was in class at MTSU. I had 2 classes back-to-back at MTSU, one at 8 o'clock. It was a Tuesday, Thursday class, so the next one started at 9:30. 9:25. There was a 10-minute break between the 2 classes. And it was shortly before the end of the first class when somebody ran into the room and said, the first tower went down. And so I dismissed class and I ran to somebody's office who had a TV. And I watched, and at that point, the second tower was coming down. I had to be in class in about 5 minutes more. And our subject was the Protestant Reformation. So what am I going to do with this? So I decided to scrap whatever we were talking about and talk about the consequences of religious extremism, which was really our subject for the day anyway. So we made it through that class, and then I had a class in the afternoon, Introduction to Islam, at Vanderbilt. So I got in the car, drove to Vanderbilt, and about 20 minutes into the class, this young woman stood up and screamed, and she had tears rolling down her cheeks. "I don't want to talk about this anymore." And she described how she was on her cell phone with one of her closest friends who was in one of the towers, and the phone went dead, and she never heard from that person again. And there was nothing I could do to console that child. I went back to my office, had a phone call from Anita Bugg at Nashville Public Radio, asking me to do an interview. And I said, I can't even deal with my own students. I said, call me back tomorrow morning. Anyway, after all of that, after that horrible day, and what made it so horrible is that at that point in my life, I had worked with Muslims, lived with Muslims for 30 years. And I had spent my professional life telling people how wonderful Islam is and how beautiful the culture is, and I could see all of that ready to go down the tubes. So I'm thinking to myself, what can I do? And it became so imminent that dialogue was important. Okay, so if dialogue's important, what are we going to dialogue about? And I'll tell you, I'm a committed Christian, so I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if Jesus could not be the subject of that dialogue? Well, how could that be? Well, believe it or not, Muslims believe in Jesus. Muslims love Jesus. And I knew that. I mean, the Quran has many, 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 many references to Jesus in the Quran. And then I had a few conversations that made me think that this could possibly work. So one of my friends' name is Herb Bodman. He's now deceased, but he's a little older than I am. He was a professor at UNC Chapel Hill teaching Islamic studies. And I was visiting Herb one day in his home, and his son Whit was visiting his father. He was there. And Whit was a Ph.D. candidate in Islamic studies at Harvard, and he was also an active practicing preacher in the United Church of Christ. So, preacher, Church of Christ, studying Islamic mysticism. And he told me, or told us, the people in the conversation, he said, my study of Islamic mysticism has helped me understand the Trinity. And I'm thinking, no, this cannot be. This is just... And he went on to explain how that worked, and his explanation made perfect sense. A second conversation was with one of my students from Pakistan. Her name is Parwana Ashari. beautiful young woman. And she wrote, our conversation started by my reading her midterm exam, when she wrote, I'm trying to get this correct now, the role of, this is her words now, the role of Jesus in Islam is underestimated. That was her word, underestimated, meaning underappreciated. And I imagine it meant by her and Muslims. I mean, Christians are not even aware of it, but many Muslims are not either of the importance of it. And then we had a number of conversations about that. And then in one of those conversations that we had after I read this, she said how she was looking forward to Yom al-Qiyamah. Yom al-Qiyamah is the day of judgment, end times, when Jesus, not Muhammad, would lead the righteous Muslims to salvation. And that's Quranic. I mean, it says that in the Quran. So again, it's a little known fact. But I'm thinking, wow, here's something that Christians and Muslims could sit down and talk about. And then the third conversation was with the Atlantic Institute, actually. I accompanied an Atlantic Institute group to Turkey. And we were in this session at the Foundation for Writers and Journalists. And our host was talking about all of this stuff that the Atlantic Institute is interested in. Incidentally, they're followers of the teachings of Fethullah Gulen, who believes in interfaith dialogue, peace, coexistence. I think of the pluralism approach. And so he's talking about all of this, and I said, well, and I didn't interrupt when he was talking, but then he said, does anybody have any questions? I said, yeah, I have a question. I said, we're here on an interfaith mission, so you're preaching to the choir. How do you teach this stuff to people who are less inclined to tolerance? And he said, without even having to think about it, he said, through humility, through example and with humility. Just like when Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. And again, that just really pushed me back. And he had a very specific notion of what humility meant here, actually, because I asked him about that. And he said, well, humility is the opposite of arrogance. So if you cannot enter an interfaith dialogue situation with an attitude of arrogance, meaning I'm right and you're wrong. I mean, that is, from the start, not going to work, not even worth trying. So another opportunity for me to show off my archaeological team. I live as a minority in the Muslim world. Everybody in this picture is Muslim except for 4 of us. So here I am. My very closest friend, Abdullah, is my co-director for the project. This is my one surviving graduate student who's finishing her Ph.D., not here, but at the Sorbonne in Paris. These 2 women are from the Sorbonne, and this is an American guy. Everybody else is Muslim. But anyway, a lot of the conversations in my book are between Abdullah and me. All right. Size of you got it. Islamic world, 1500s, pretty big. I'm not going to say any more about that. I do want to comment a little bit on this. At that point in time, 1500, there were still now 2 great superpowers in the world. The Safavid Empire, which is mostly Persian politically, but they had a lot of areas that were not Persian. That's all the green stuff. The red stuff is the Ottoman Empire, Muslim, both Muslim actually. But what I want to impress upon you here is look at the Ottoman Empire. And if you were European wanting to engage in commerce with the Far East, what's the issue here? How the heck am I going to get there without going through the Ottoman Empire? And mind you, it's not that the Ottomans were against trade, it's just that they charged for the privilege of conducting trade through their territory. So that's what motivated Europeans to look for alternate routes to the Far East, right? Either around Africa, or of course Columbus had this whole other idea how he was going to, this is why, okay? Okay, in 1453, I mean, this is when the Ottoman Empire gained control of Constantinople. There's this new diorama in Istanbul. It's incredibly wonderful. So I'm standing in the middle of it here, and you really get the sense that you're there in the battlefield. It's amazing. But that was, I don't want to go that far yet. This was such a traumatic event for European, for the Christian world. 1453 was hell for the Christian world. Now I do have to introduce one dying kingdom. It's the kingdom of the Nassirids in southern Spain. It's the last surviving kingdom of Spain. Of course, at one time, most of Spain was Muslim. But one by one, they started being picked off by the Christians in the north. The last surviving one was the Nassirids, and the capital was Granada, founded by Sultan Muhammad I. But this is the end. This is 1492 when King Ferdinand and Isabella defeated the Nassirids. And here they're at Granada, and the king of Granada is giving over the keys. What's really interesting about this is that in this crowd on the right is a man named Christopher Columbus. Okay, why was he there? Well, he had already been turned down by the Portuguese. And he had actually already been turned down by Ferdinand and Isabella too. But now, with the momentum of the victory against the Muslims, Columbus got this idea: I'm going to ride the coattails of this momentum and see if they won't finance the trip or the exploration trip in the other direction. So there was actually a crusading attempt in the 1450s to try to regain Constantinople. It failed. But this is a quotation from Columbus's journal. Your Highnesses, so he's addressing Ferdinand and Isabella, Catholic and Christians and princes loving the holy Christian faith and the spreading of it, and enemies of the sect of Muhammad and of all idolatries and heresies, decided to send me, Christopher Columbus, da-da-da-da-da. He then goes on to say that he will share or donate a portion of the riches from his journey to mount yet another crusade to retake Constantinople. And that sealed the deal. And so, you know, the history of the Middle East or the Islamic world in the 1400s explains everything about Christopher Columbus. Well, not everything, but a lot of things. All right, I got to move quickly here because now I'm on my extended time. So I took this wonderful course in graduate school from Professor Gerald Brown, most brilliant lecturer I ever had, on imperialism. That was the course, imperialism. And he had this knack of summarizing so much information in a key sentence. So he defined imperialism from Columbus to the 19th century as, quote, an imperialism of trade but not dominion. There's something wrong here, yeah, okay. It should be not dominion. Yeah, I did this pretty early. What he meant by that is that when Europeans were scurrying all over the place establishing colonies, their ideal approach would be minimal involvement and maximum profit. And as long as they could get what they wanted from the places where they were going without having to really send armies and set up governments, and I mean, that would be the best approach. But then the new imperialism, the 19th and early 20th centuries, his sentence, pre-industrial supply could no longer meet post-industrial demand. So as they're getting all of these raw materials in all of their colonies, the Industrial Revolution increased their need to such an extent that they had to put much more investment into the effort. And that's when they started establishing direct control. Okay, so that was my lesson in his class. Okay, so now we're talking about the new imperialism period, okay? So what is the relationship between colonizer and colonized? Or maybe I should phrase it this way: who is in control of the relationship between colonized? Easy question, right? That's a rhetorical question. What? Not an easy question?
Not to a colonial historian.
Ah, okay. Okay. To a non-colonial historian, the discourse at least, is controlled by the colonizer. But there are reciprocal views of each other, right? So what is the predominant view, at least vis-a-vis of the Islamic world, Europeans vis-a-vis the Islamic world, of the colonizer versus colonized? The term that's used by Edward Said and other people who write along that line is called Orientalism. Okay, many of you have heard that term. What is that like? So what the term basically means is that the way we talk about the Islamic world is from a position of control, or superior, control, I think is the best way to put it. And what that does, not, control of what? Well, control of the language that you use to describe it. All right, and part of that is this notion that the British developed, for example, that the sun never sets on the British Empire. One of the best examples of the kind of relationship this is now the French, the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt. Okay, during that period of occupation, they brought along scholars besides soldiers, and they produced this multi-volume encyclopedia of everything you needed to know about Egypt, the Encyclopédie d'Égypte. Believe it or not, each volume, they have a copy of the original edition in the rare book room at Vanderbilt. Each volume is 1 meter by 1 meter big. That in itself is a statement of power. And a meter, yeah, a meter by a meter. I mean, each book is, well, and they got these huge plates. I mean, it's amazing. And all kinds of information. No, that's painting. So that in itself, so what did the French do? They went to Egypt and they gathered all of this information. They brought it back to France and processed it and then gave it back to Egyptians. And so Egyptians who wanted to know anything about their own history learned it from the French, processed in French terms. And the whole control of the Department of Antiquities in Egypt was controlled by the French until 1956. Okay? So that's one aspect of Orientalism. All right, painting is the same thing, sort of these romantic paintings. I mean, what kind of images do these convey? All right, we don't have time to talk about them individually, but just sort of evoke images in your mind. This is one of my favorite, Jerome's painting of the Call to Prayer. I love this painting. So what kind of feelings do you get here? Now, put this in the hands of a modern day Orientalist, and this is what you can get. Woo. Is that not interesting? Okay? Now, there's a reverse to Orientalism, which scholars in my business call Occidentalism. That's impressions of Easterners toward us. So what do you suppose those views are like?
Oppressor.
You would think, and I would think, and I thought, and I think in many cases it is.
This book says it's admiration,
Yeah.
technology.
Yeah, okay, so, I mean, you all know who Tom Friedman is, right? I used to use this, I love this book. I mean, it's the only book that he wrote that I really like, and it's the first one that he wrote. And before Tom Friedman became Tom Friedman, he was really good. But what I liked about what he did in his early work was his very, very, very acute observations of what people were like in the Islamic world. For example, his description of the clock on Mughrabi Square in Tel Aviv. He said he would sit for hours at the coffee shop across the street and watch Israeli after Israeli, because there was no glass face on the clock. So person after person would come and stand in front of the clock. He'd look at his watch and he would adjust the clock. And somebody else would come and look at his watch and move the hand somewhere else. To illustrate the point that everybody had their own opinion as to what time it was. And of course theirs was right and everybody else's was wrong. I mean, what an insightful thing that he said. Okay, so oops. He asked that question in a talk that he had with university students in Kuwait one day. And so what do you think of us, Westerners? And this young woman answered his question and she said, we hold you in such admiration for all of the things you say, for technology. I mean, we have so much to learn from you. Why is it that you look down on us so much? So I would describe the response to Orientalism as ambivalent. Okay? Ambivalent. All right, I think I'll do jihad and quit there. So this is another pretty inflammatory word. And I think I can cheat enough for 9 more minutes. So what kind of things come to your mind when you see this word, jihad?
Holy war.
Holy war, okay. Yeah, okay, so all of this, so it's pretty negative stuff. All right, so one day, I was invited to do a lecture comparing jihad on the one hand with holy war on the other hand. Jihad, holy war, are they the same was the title of my talk. So I thought a good place to start would be with dictionary definitions. So I started with definitions of crusade. Webster does this. Any of the military expeditions undertaken by Christians in Europe, 11th, 12th, 13th. So that's crusades with capital C. Or it could be any war carried on under papal sanction, any vigorous, aggressive movement for the defense or advancement of an idea. Okay? Try a different dictionary, you got to get different views on this. A remedial enterprise undertaking with zeal and enthusiasm. So that could be a lot of things. In fact, if you Google crusade, you're going to get millions of hits. So there are all kinds of crusades, right? Crusade for literacy, crusade against the death penalty. I mean, all kinds of crusades.
Crusade for Christ.
Crusade for Christ, absolutely. Okay? All right, definition of jihad. Webster. A holy war waged on behalf of Islam as a religious duty. Okay, well that corresponds to some of the definitions we read. A crusade for a principle or a belief. Good. American College Dictionary. A war of Mohammedans. Never call Muslims Mohammedans. They hate it. Upon others with a religious object. Okay. Any crusade against some belief. Not bad. At this point, I realized that I was going about this wrong. What was wrong with this approach?
You're looking in
English dictionaries, exactly. So definition of jihad in an Arabic dictionary comes from jahada, to strive or struggle. The form of jihad means determined effort. Okay? Those who believe and suffer exile and strive. This is the Quranic verse that talks about jihad. Those who believe and suffer exile and strive, the form of jihad is jahadu, third person plural, with might and main in God's cause. So anyone who struggles for God's cause is waging jihad. Okay? In modern times, holy war. Okay, so even this is actually an Arabic to English dictionary that used this third one. All right, I'll skip that. I wrote a book about this. So there are actually 5 very different kinds of jihads. Jihad bin nafs or kalb, jihad of the heart or soul. So that's a very internal thing. So anyone who strives to be a righteous person is waging jihad. Jihad bilisan, jihad of the tongue. So anyone who speaks out against evil is waging jihad. Jihad bil kalam or ilm, jihad of the pen and knowledge. This one's interesting. In 1984, my graduate school mentor retired. And so 6 of his Ph.D. students got together and we held a conference in his honor and we each presented a paper on the theme of jihad. And I built my whole talk on jihad bi kalam, holding our professor as the model of jihadist, talking about jihad by the pen and knowledge. He was so eminently wise and had the sharpest red pencil that you could imagine. And then jihad bil yad, jihad of the hand, so anyone who does good works, contributes to building a hospital, visits the poor. That's jihad by the hand. And then finally, jihad bis sayf, jihad of the sword. which is, it has to be, to qualify as jihad, has to be a defensive effort and an effort that is a last resort. All right, and I'll end with one more Nasruddin story. So one day, Nasruddin decided to hold a party for his friends. And there was this special dish that he had been wanting to fix, but he invited a lot of friends, and he didn't have a pot that was big enough. So he went to one of his neighbors to ask if he could borrow this big cauldron that he knew his neighbor had. And his neighbor said, of course, I mean, sure. I mean, he was actually on the guest list. So yeah, you know, that'll be fine. And Nasruddin made the dish and invited all of his guests. Everybody had a great time. They went home happy. And the next day, Nasruddin brought the cauldron back with this nice little pot inside of it. And the neighbor said, well, where did this little pot come from? And he said, well, you know, while your pot was in my care, it gave birth to this little pot, and I would like you to have it as a gesture of appreciation. And the man said, oh, wow, thank you. That was really nice. And a month later, Nasruddin, I mean, that worked so well the first time, he said, well, I'm going to do this again. So he went to borrow the pot from his neighbor again, the cauldron. Another party, everything went great. The next day, he did not bring the cauldron back. In fact, 2 weeks went by, and he did not bring the cauldron back. And finally, the neighbor got a little bit impatient, and he came to see Nasruddin, and he said, you know, you borrowed that pot from me a couple of weeks ago, and you haven't brought it back yet. And he said, yeah, I've been meaning to tell you, but when your pot was in my care, it died. And the guy said, come on, a pot can't die. He said, well, 2 weeks ago you were willing to believe that it gave birth. So what's the lesson there? I mean, the lesson there is that we tend to believe what suits our need, right, or suits our purpose.